Welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. Today I'm very excited because I've realized I've done now, this is episode 51, and I've never covered
Wow.
the topic. Yeah, it's been quite a while now, a few years, but I've never covered the topic of Solomonic magic, which is obviously a very big part of the Western esoteric tradition. And finally, I got a good guest to cover the topic on, Sara Mastros, who has a book out on the topic, or maybe you can show the book too, huh? Okay, cool. Yeah. Definitely I plan to check out that book as well. But yeah, maybe you can kind of share how obviously you wrote a book on the topic. It's something you're interested in, something you practice. Maybe you can share a little bit about how you got into this specific type of magic. Mhm.
So I got into magic quite young, like young enough that it's hard for me to say when I got in.
Mhm.
I generally think like all 5-year-olds are magicians and most of them just grow out of it, but that just didn't work on me. Like I just kept doing it, even though it was like baby stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so in this story that I'm about to tell, I think I'm probably around 14 or 15. I'm in high school, but not old enough to drive yet, is what I
Mm.
will say. And the library, my dad's office was like right down the block from our public library.
Mhm.
So in the summers, like we would work at the office for my dad for a while, but then I didn't work all day long. So I'd also go to the library sometimes,
Mm.
right? And so I lived in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, like Amish country. So as you can imagine, our library was not like replete with occult books, right? And I already read literally everything in the like witchcraft and occult section, which sounds impressive, but that was like 15 books, right?
Yeah.
So I had started sort of like scouring other sections of library because I'd spoken with the librarians. And what they said was they couldn't keep those books in because they got stolen all the time.
Mm.
And they didn't know if they were being stolen by like witches. They
Mhm.
suspected they were actually being stolen by Christians who just didn't want them on the shelf,
That makes sense.
which where I lived, I think is probably the case.
Right.
Um, but they recommended to me that like if I dug through the card catalog, because so for young people, like the internet does not exist in this story, right? This story is
Mhm.
set in 1992,
Mhm.
probably,
Mhm.
right? So there's a paper card catalog. So it's not that easy to look up books.
Mhm.
You can look them up by like author or title
Mhm.
or like hard, what
Mhm.
shelf category they're in,
Mhm.
but it's not that easy to look them up by keyword. But they taught me some tricks for doing that. And so I was starting to find books on witchcraft and occult that were in other sections because those didn't get
Mhm.
stolen because you had to do work to find them.
Okay, that
Right.
makes sense. Yeah.
And so in the German history section, I found a book called Ritual Magic by E.M. Butler,
Okay.
which is a book I really strongly recommend.
Mhm.
So what it is it's like a scholarly history of grimoire magic,
Okay.
basically.
Mm.
And that was my first encounter with Solomonic magic.
Mm.
And can't speak for other people about when they got in, but like when I get in, particularly, in like the late 80s and early 90s,
Mhm.
there wasn't a lot of great stuff available, especially if you didn't live in a big city, right? And especially, I mean, I'm still a kid, so I don't like
Mm.
my ability to you'll notice this story started with I got to go to the library because it was near my dad's office. Like I couldn't just go
Right.
drive to the big city or something on
Right.
my own, right? For a couple years still. So like I was finding magic, but
Mhm.
like of everything I would read, it would be like you read 90 pages of bullshit. And then there's like one golden page, and you're like, this is the real magic. Like I can feel it. And I
Right.
knew that you would find that in other places besides magic books as well. So I'd say the
Mm.
first place I ever found that was in an ancient history textbook in my eighth grade ancient history course. We had a text called Primary Sources in Ancient History, and it
Mm.
had something labeled A Spell from Ancient Mesopotamia.
Oh.
Now, I want to be clear, this textbook, which I have bought
Uh-huh.
since, like off Amazon, I fronted it down, which was tricky because I didn't actually know what it was called.
Uh-huh.
Like, I just kind of like, oh, I think it was a horse on the cover, but I spent a lot of time digging through. I
Yeah.
finally found this book because I wanted a source for this,
Mhm.
right? Because in my little like 13-year-old book of shadows, I had copied out the spell, but I didn't copy like the sourcing because I'm 13. And here's a pro tip to
Right.
youngins: like
Right.
you will regret not writing down the sources, so just write it down because
Yeah.
20 years later you're gonna want it.
Right.
But it turns out my history text didn't source it,
Hmm.
right?
Interesting.
But I will say now, as an experienced magician, I can tell you I'm almost positive
Mhm.
that is a Thorkild Jacobson translation of a Mukul tablet
Oh,
because
interesting.
because I'm just a person, like this is what a nerd I am, is I just maybe recognize that when I but it's interesting because like that was the very first thing I hit that I was like, oh, this is much better than the magic I'm making up myself based on like the one Wiccan book and like fairy tales and talking to trees and ghosts.
Right.
And I'm like, so I was putting together like my spells worked, but there was like I just knew that there had to be something I was missing, right? And that was the first place I really felt like I touched it and I was like, oh fuck. So I'll tell you that spell begins: scorching fire, warlike son of heaven, fiercest of thy brethren, burn the man or woman who has cursed me. And then it goes on like that.
And that was from the history book, that specific one.
That was in my history book, yes.
Wow, what a trip, huh? Interesting. Okay.
It wasn't our main textbook. That was this was the best teacher I ever had. And I want to be clear, like I taught high school for a long time. I'm actually quite a snob about teaching. The only teacher in high school I had that I now as a teacher would characterize as like very good. Her name then was Mrs. Kimbom, but she actually got married and divorced several times over the course of like I had her, this is 7th grade. I had her again in 12th grade and she was like on her 3rd name by then. But she was an amazing teacher. So we had the regular textbook, and then she also had us get this primary sources textbook, just like snippets from things, which, so that was in there, kind of buried, but it was in there. And I was like, oh, okay, right? But the one of the next times, the first time I found like a whole book of that, and not just, because this was like one, 12-line spell, right? That with no source material and really not much context. And I asked my history teacher, and like she gave me like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is awesome, and I appreciate her having given that to me, but was not the Mukul tablets, because how could she conceivably have known that, right? I only know that because I have an internet and I'm like a deep magic nerd.
Right.
So, but this book, Ritual Magic, similarly, basically as soon as but it had a picture of, it had, the Alpheus Levi image of Baphomet? It had that on the cover, and I was like, fuck yeah. And then I opened it. I was like, oh, this is why this has to be in the German history section, because they definitely would have burned this one, right? So I found it. I mean, I don't know if they burned them. That's probably an exaggeration. I think they just steal them from the library. Don't take them back, right? Maybe they burned them. I'm not really invited to Christian book burning parties. I don't know what happens.
Right.
So I got this book and I opened it, and it's a history of grimoire magic. So it doesn't have any complete grimoire, but what it does have is like large excerpts. Like it'll have like a full oration from this grimoire and then a full conjuration from that grimoire. And it really like compares and contrasts like the structure of different grimoires and talks about how they evolved over history, which like I'm actually really glad that that's the book I learned from instead of like one particular grimoire. Because it really like made me think about like this is the structure of how this kind of magic works. And like it had enough of the orations and stuff that like I could assemble a complete, like it had one of every kind of oration, and they didn't quite fit together, but I just kind of massaged them. And the other thing is, I want to remind people that I'm 14 in this story, and I'm like a particular naive 14. So I will say, so like when these grimoires said that this was like the magic of King Solomon passed down, believed. Now, that I think like that meant Solomon had written the book, but I definitely understood them to be saying that this was a Christian corruption, like a medieval and early Renaissance Christian corruption of a much earlier Jewish practice. But I want to like the historian writing the book did not say that, but that's what grimoires say. And she didn't like clearly articulate to a 14-year-old that was false. So I just believed, and I was like, well, that's cool. I'm Jewish. So I'm just going to uncorrupt it. Like every time it's like the Christian prayers, I'm just going to un-Christian them and fill in the gaps with like Jewish prayers. Right?
Interesting.
So I basically kind of assembled my own grimoire of excerpts from a variety of grimoires, almost exclusively, I would say, like Western European Christian grimoires, like the ones you normally think.
Sure.
Right? But I moved it, but I did that with the understanding that like there was some original magical teaching given by King Solomon that had like filtered through history and changed and whatever, and that like I could triangulate between them to get like, certainly King Solomon wasn't orating to Jesus. Like that was clear to me at 14. So I like took those parts out, and also structurally the places where like I was like, been to a mass, and this is definitely not how King Solomon would have done this, because I've also been to school, right? So I rearranged it a little bit, and I had to write my own. And because of that, I really had to like deeply interact with the text.
Okay.
Which I think is a much more profitable way to learn anything, rather than like people were like, oh, I did it exactly the way it says in the grimoire. Like that's not a flex. Like as a teacher, when somebody comes to me like, copied the textbook exactly, I'm like, oh honey, good job. But like that's not what you're really supposed to be doing. It's like a teaching example to take apart and make your own. And because I didn't have a complete book, I had no option other than to do that. Right. So I really love that book. I really recommend that book. Now I will say that, like, you know, that book was written in I'm going to guess, I should have looked this up before this interview because I knew we were going to talk about this, but I think probably the late 40s would be my guess.
Okay.
Right. So there is like some of the scholarship definitely has like a quite colonialist tinge. It's written by a British historian of German history who is not welcome in Germany at this point. She's been teaching like quite loudly against Nazis and like the lead up to Nazis for quite a while at this point. Okay, here's something else. So that's the book I learned. And then, like, and that magic worked great for me. Like, I loved it. It was immediately, I touched it and I was like, oh, yeah. And also, it was a magic that really rewarded nerd work. You know what I mean? Like, digging into the Hebrew and Greek and, like, just being a book nerd, it really rewarded that kind of magic. Or that kind of thing. And I'm good at that. So, like, I want to be clear, like, I think sometimes people posture that like being an intellectual is somehow necessary to be a magician, which is not true at all. But I think whatever it is that like you're really good at, you should think about how to harness that for your magic. So if you're a painter, like you should be thinking about how can I use painting in my magic, right? And if you're like an athlete, you should be thinking about how to use that in your magic. But I am a nerd. So for me, I do nerd magic. That's my favorite, right? And the Solomonic Magic was very much that. And it was also, like, to grossly oversimplify, like half Jewish and half Greek, just like me, right? Also very exciting. Like my mom was Jewish, my dad was Greek. And I've been like tangentially involved in Wicca a little bit at this point. Which this is not a commentary on all Wicca, but the particular like Wiccan coven I landed in, no, it was not good. Like this was a room full of adults telling me, I'm 13 maybe, telling me that I'm like evil. Basically. God. They did not. This sounds ridiculous, but I think many people who got into magic, particularly people who got into magic young, will understand this. You know, I just believed in magic. And I was, maybe other people are more socially savvy than me. But when I did magic, I expected it to work. And it took me many occasions of like being in groups of other magicians to determine that they did not, like when they summoned the Mistress of Beasts, not only did they not expect it to work, they didn't want it to work. They didn't like it when it worked, and they were scared of me when it worked.
Interesting.
And like I understand I'm a little spooky, but also it was just not like that's not there's no circumstance in which I think it is inappropriate for an adult to tell a little kid, like a little kid, but like a 13-year-old that they're evil. So I was basically out of Wicca at that point, right? But that was like what I had available. But this was much more like my style, right? And again, I was naive, so I just kind of took things at face value. If it said like you do these things, then like the spirit will show up and you will have a conversation. I was like, okay. And then that more or less worked. Right. So that was really my introduction to Solomonic Magic, right? And one of the things I picked up, I'm sorry I'm rambling. So
no, it's interesting. Yeah, it's good. It's good. Very good. Very good.
Tonight, right? Like one of the things I picked up from my time in Wicca was that you should be doing like the paganisms of your ancestors. But like as somebody who was half Jewish and half Greek, what a jackpot in terms of magic, right? Like that opened up this entire like field of like, you know, late antiquity, like Solomonic, but also like PGM, which I didn't know for a long, like I didn't hit the PGM for many years after this, but I was really into that kind of magic. And that's sort of how I got into Solomonic Magic.
Okay, okay. In retrospect, I mean, it kind of sounds like you started with Solomonic magic, right? Because via the book you mentioned, ritual magic, it's sort of like that's what stick out to
Practicing
you.
magic, I will say I've been practicing magic for
Mm-hmm.
like 5 years at that point.
Okay, okay.
Right. So I'd done other things, but that was definitely the magic where I feel like
Mm-hmm.
I learned to be a grown-up magician. Like it was the first
Okay,
system of magic that was like a whole coherent system
okay.
and not like I learned this from this place and this from that place and I like put it together. I
Mm.
mean, I think around the same time I was doing Builders of the Adytum had like a mail order correspondence course
Okay,
in
okay.
like Hermeticism, which I think I
Right.
had probably I believe I was at least already started in that before I started on Solomonic Magic, but they were more or less the same time. And so I also had that kind of hermetic thing,
Mm.
but that was disappointing compared to this.
Okay, okay.
Like
Uh,
to me, like these
mhm.
are not like value judgments on Wicca
Sure.
or on I'm just saying like when I hit them, I was
Right.
like, okay, this is cool. I can see
Hmm.
like the cool pieces of this,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
but this is not like what I imagined a wizard doing. But
Right, right.
Solomonic Magic, that's what I fucking imagined wizards doing. Like when I imagined magic as like a 10-year-old, that's what I was imagining.
Right, right. What do you think are the unique traits of Solomonic magic compared to these other, you talked about like hermetics and other things like that. What do you think is the unique aspect of this system, this form of?
Okay, so there's
Mhm.
an easy way to answer that and a complicated way. So I'm going to give the complicated way first, but I
Okay.
won't go too into detail, right?
Okay.
So Solomonic Magic is this whole complicated like constellation of magics,
Okay.
and there's certainly not like clean boundaries around it,
Mm.
right? So there's a
Mhm.
scholar named M.L. West, and he's talking about Orphism, which is another like kind of thing I do,
Mhm.
right? And he says that the only real way to define Orphism is
Mhm.
that it is the practices attributed to Orpheus.
Okay.
And so like the
Mm.
simplest version is that like what makes Solomonic magic Solomonic is
Mhm.
that like people claim that
Mhm.
it came from Solomon Magician King,
Okay.
right? And like that was I like that. Like I still rely very to me
Mhm.
again my very naive like I didn't have any kind of instruction. I just like had the history of these texts, but certainly like whether or not that author believed in magic and was a magician, I will
Mm.
say, having done some more research, I think more than people give her credit for.
Okay.
Also, 15 years later, I found out that E.M. Butler was Eliza Marion Butler.
Huh.
Because for the 15 years between, okay, here's why that's important. For
Uh-huh.
the like 15 years between picking up that book,
Mhm.
like being active in Solomonic magic, I
Mhm.
did not meet a single woman involved in Solomonic magic.
Okay.
And the Solomonic magician practitioners I met were like pretty much across the board pretty misogynistic. So
Huh.
finding out that
Interesting.
this book I had cut my teeth on was written by a woman was
Right.
also really exciting for me. That happened much, much later,
Oh, okay. Okay.
right? It's why I publish under Sara Mastros instead of like SL. Some of my very
Mm.
early work is published as SL Mastros because this is just a fact. Like
Mm.
having a female coded name on a book
Mhm.
decreases sales of the book. That's just a
Ah,
fact.
I see. I see.
Like, I mean, it's bullshit, but that's just a fact, right?
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
it's one of the reasons why I use my whole name because for me, it was so, like, as a little girl, it was so powerful.
Right.
Little girl. I was like 19, but you know what I'm
Right,
saying?
right, right.
Like, it was really powerful to me to find out that this person that, like, I didn't know that.
It's actually
It was
female.
not a,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah. So that was also exciting. But,
Mm.
like, I don't know how into the magic she was, but the
Mhm.
book was certainly written in an academic context
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
she like didn't there was no it
Mhm.
was not intended. Here's the thing, I believe that text actually is intended to teach you magic,
Okay.
but
Okay.
it is intended to do that in such a way that non-magicians won't notice. Like it's an academic book and it has to
Mm.
like pass the academia bit,
Right, but it had sort of a
which
maybe
means
a subtle invitation to practice the
gave
technique.
you everything you
Uh-huh.
would need to do that.
Right.
And
Okay.
it didn't. Some academic books like really look
Uh-huh.
down their nose. They're like, we all know that magic
Mhm.
isn't real. Like,
Right.
and this book does not do that,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that
Right.
was enough for me,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So let me think about how to say this.
Hmm.
The To me, it
Hmm.
seemed obvious
Hmm.
that like if this magic was called Solomonic,
Hmm.
like Solomon must be an important figure
Hmm.
in the magic itself.
Sure. Sure.
Right? So even though this didn't really happen, like I can't say where. To me, this idea seemed very obvious that like an early stage in this magic would be to like ask Solomon for help with it.
Okay. Okay.
So like I thought that was clear, but I have since learned that that is not necessarily a traditional part of Solomonic magic.
Huh,
But
interesting.
I think it should. I again
Uh-huh.
still think that it used to be. Like I think that
Mhm.
was implied, and the
Mhm.
grimoires don't say that because you should already know that.
Right. Okay.
But I don't know. So that's another thing that like is I think different in my practice than many other people's practice of Solomonic magic. Is
Okay.
like one of the first things I teach
Mhm.
is to build that working relationship with Solomon,
Okay. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And it's partly also because I'm unchristianizing the text. So
Mm.
you know when you swap out Jesus,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And like are Jewifying it.
Hmm.
Judaizing is actually the word for that, right? You like yeah, most usually people who use that word definitely mean it in a bad context, but there is a word for
Right.
it, right?
Right.
Like sometimes
Uh-huh.
the appropriate substitution is to like substitute Jesus out for like God. Like
Hmm.
uh, I understand that Christians understand Jesus to be God, but like
Right.
sometimes when Christians are talking about Jesus, like they're really talking about Jesus in this very like transcendental big G God way.
Right. Right. Right.
But sometimes they're talking about him in a much more human way.
Hmm.
But I still don't want to talk to Jesus, so I'm swapping in Solomon in those times. Like in the name
Mm.
of Solomon,
Oh,
blah blah
interesting.
blah blah blah, who learned from the angels, who learned from the ineffable one, El
Uh,
Shaddai, blah 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 blah, right?
okay.
And so that's how I think ended up with it is structurally
Hmm.
like they were calling on this sort of
Hmm.
mighty dead magician.
Right.
It was Jesus, but they're like sometimes when they said Jesus, they meant that, and sometimes they
Mm.
meant like God.
Hmm. Hmm.
And again, I understand that somehow in Christianity those are identical, but
Mm.
I don't know, too Jewish. I don't they don't seem identical to me at all.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so for me, like that's sort of where I started is
Okay.
working with Solomon Magician King and these
Okay.
grimoires. And again, I just sort of expected it to work,
Hmm.
and it did.
Okay.
And that's how I got into Solomonic magic, I guess.
Oh, that's amazing. Do you find so the system itself, it's basically working with these specific entities or demons. They're referred to as demons, I believe, right?
Well, Solomonic magic broadly works with
Mhm.
a lot of categories of Hebraic spirits,
Okay.
which in English we would normally call both angels and demons.
Okay. Hmm.
But
Hmm.
like, okay, so when we talk about Solomonic magic, right?
Yes. Yes.
Solomonic magic, the way we think of it, it like braids together all these different sources, right?
Okay.
So like Egyptian priestcraft and
Mhm.
Babylonian astrotheology
Hmm.
and like Greek Goetia
Greek,
and
yeah.
also and but then this like big influx, well not
Mhm.
influx, I would say like the central element, right,
Okay.
is this Hebrew sorcery, right?
Okay.
Hebrew theurgy, Jewish theurgy. And
Okay.
it sort of braids these together in late antiquity, right? Like
Mm,
that's
okay.
when Solomonic magic sort of coalesces into a thing, like
Mm,
not in the time of Solomon. So
right.
for I know you know this, but for listeners, when we say late antiquity, especially when we say it in the context of like Jewish stuff, we really mean a couple of centuries before Christianity to
Hmm.
a couple of centuries after Islam.
Hmm.
I don't
Hmm.
mean after Islam arises, like clearly
Okay.
Islam's
Yeah.
not.
Right. Right.
But that's like sort of the period we're talking about. And
Okay.
that's the period in which Solomonic magic grows. And it's really like one coherent thing. But
Okay.
then it starts to branch off, right? And so you
Hmm.
end up with this Western Christian tradition.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
end up with like a Byzantine, so that is to say, like a Latin tradition, really, a
Sure.
Catholic Latin tradition.
Hmm.
You end up with a Byzantine Greek tradition, and
Hmm.
those two are quite deeply connected to each other. Like they're
Mm.
in contact with each other the whole time. But there's
Hmm.
also this whole Arabic tradition of Solomonic
Right.
magic and a whole Hebrew Jewish tradition of
Hmm.
Solomonic magic
Hmm.
that like when people talk about Solomonic magic, they're often talking only about that Western Christian kind, right? So in the Western Christian
Mm.
kind, when you're doing it in English or in Germanic or Romance languages, right? Then we would
Hmm.
call those spirits angels or demons. But in Arabic and Hebrew, like there's maybe more. Demon covers a lot of categories of spirits,
Mm. Okay. That's a good
right?
point.
That in
That's a good
other
point.
languages and in other cosmologies, we would maybe separate out a little more.
Mm.
But
Okay.
Solomonic magic generally works with angels, demons,
Hmm.
and occasionally other kinds of spirits, but broadly that.
Mm. Okay. Interesting. I like that you also pulled that like there's the what is it, the Goets or of the Greek tradition?
Goetia, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sure.
So it's really a syncretic, like basically where this sprung from is a very syncretic. sort of a mix, as you mentioned, right, from the Hebrew tradition, from the Greek tradition, and then kind of grew out to these different strands and these different, what would you say, systems or views or, I guess just different
Just
traditions,
sort of
different ways of
different
seeing it.
schools or different traditions.
Schools,
And they're
right.
really like, you know, what's keeping those traditions apart
Hmm.
is language, right? Like
Right.
those Western Christian Europeans, like almost none of them read Arabic and very few
Hmm.
of them read Hebrew. And like not even that many read Greek,
Okay.
right?
Right.
Whereas in some way, like the Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic speaking magicians are
Mhm.
more likely to read Western languages than the other way
Mm,
around.
that makes
Indeed,
sense.
most people in Europe couldn't even read their own language.
Okay. Yeah.
Like
Interesting.
literacy is
Yeah.
just more, the further west you go, the less at this time period, right?
Right.
Like Middle Easterners and people
Uh,
in Eastern Europe, like Greek, are just much more likely to be literate generally
mm.
and more likely to be literate in a variety of languages.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
And
So
Solomonic magic is a deeply literate magic.
right.
Like it's magic about names and writing.
Okay. Okay. What do you find this type of magic specifically useful for compared to, so why would you recommend somebody to explore this form of magic as opposed to, maybe whatever some other forms, right? How do you see it as being particularly useful?
So there's
Hmm.
a lot of different ways to categorize magic,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so in one way, Solomonic magic, like what sets it apart is really just this cultural
Hmm.
instantiation. So
Hmm.
if you're into that, like if I said like this grew out of like Hebrew and Greek magic in late antiquity, we're like, yeah, fuck yeah, you should definitely look into Solomonic magic. But
Hmm.
truthfully, you probably already have, right? Like if you're excited about that time period, you're probably already into this,
Yeah.
right? But there's another way in which Solomonic magic
Hmm.
is generally typified. Like Solomonic magic exists in all kinds of magic. There's Solomonic alchemy, there's
Hmm.
Solomonic like low magic, Solomonic herbalism, like all of those
Hmm.
things exist because it's a cultural framework, not a like
Hmm.
modality of magic. Even
Sure.
though in the West we generally think of this very specific like
Right.
spirit conjuration modality,
Like the
right?
keys of Solomon and stuff like that. Yeah.
But only parts of the key. Like there's actually a lot
Mhm.
of other stuff in the Key of Solomon that
Mhm.
I think just isn't as sexy. Like people don't. I'm not
Right.
sure, right?
Yeah.
But the one of the things I really like about Solomonic magic is its focus on like names and words,
Okay.
right? And so, like I was saying before, like if you're good at painting, you should paint. If you're good at
Mm.
music, you should sing. But if
Mhm.
you're good at words,
Mhm.
you're going to be into Solomonic magic. Like if
Okay.
you're a poet, if you're a linguist, like if you
Huh.
want to play word games,
Right.
you will like this kind of magic because it's just
Okay.
structurally a lot of it works that way.
Okay.
Other things that are nice about Solomonic magic relative to other kinds of magic. So there are other ways to categorize magic. You
Hmm.
can categorize by culture and categorize by modality.
Hmm.
There's another way to categorize it that is sort of by like power source, if that makes any sense. So I'm not just like endorsing this categorization I'm about to give, but it's an easy one and it
Hmm.
makes the point I want to make right now. So
Okay.
Agrippa, in the 3 books of occult philosophy, he breaks magic down into 3 categories,
Okay.
which he calls natural magic, which is
Hmm.
what we would today usually call sympathetic magic,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
So in its essence, that's magic that's bound into matter,
Hmm.
right? So magic of like rocks and
Right.
plants
Hmm.
and like you make little dolls and you play with them or you like tie
Right.
candles together, all that kind of stuff. But also magic that's most primarily mediated in your own body,
Mm. Okay.
right? So something like Reiki or
Mhm.
anything that's like internal energy work, that is
Mhm.
also mediated in matter. Like your body counts as matter in this, right? So
Mm.
that's this first category, natural magic,
Mhm.
right? The second category he calls celestial, but
Okay.
we would call astrological,
Right. Right.
right? And
Mm.
it's magic that's bound into time, right? So
Mm.
you're like capturing the essence of a perfect moment for
Mhm.
something,
Mhm.
right? You're predicting what's going to happen based
Mm.
on like astrological phenomena.
Mm.
And then he has this third category, which he calls divine magic,
Okay.
and I would call ideal. But I don't really mean ideal like perfect. I mean ideal
Mm.
like made out of ideas,
Okay.
right? But I mean, I picked that word on purpose because I
Mhm.
kind of mean perfect in the
Mm.
sense of divine,
Mm.
right? And that's magic that's not bound in time
Okay.
or like time or matter,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that's convenient.
Mm.
Like it's nice that Solomonic magic, for the most part, does not rely on. Like that is not to say it doesn't ever use like complicated materia.
Sure.
or it doesn't have value for like complicated astrological elections. But in its essence, it does not require either of those things, right? Like Solomonic Magick is quite robust to using any kind of materia, and it is quite robust against like doing it at even relatively inauspicious times.
Okay.
Right. And that I think is one of its real values. Not necessarily that you should ignore those other two kinds. Like I like the other two kinds too.
Right.
And it's always better. Like the reason I'm skeptical about categorizing magic generally is I think in practice as magicians, we're always mixing modalities. We're always like those 3 levels. We're always a good spell should really be operating at all 3 of them. In my opinion, or it can. It's beneficial, right? So, like, if you're gonna write a Solomonic pentacle, right, which is a kind of written amulet, it does not need to be made on any kind of. People really today are very fixated on the idea that it has to be engraved in a particular metal, but metals are not even the most traditional. Like traditionally, they would be written with ink on parchment. So, like, I don't know why people are currently fixated on metal ones, except to say that a metal pentacle, like a laser engraved metal pentacle that you then enchant, sells for about $400. And a handwritten parchment one, which takes 4 times longer to make.
Sure.
And you need to be pretty fluent in Hebrew to do them.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? You have to actually copy them like pretty well.
Right.
Sells for like $100. So honestly, that's why I think people like the metal ones.
Sure.
Because they're shiny. But that's not even the traditional.
That makes sense.
So what I'm saying is, but you could just write them. Like I have many times written them with a ballpoint pen on plain copy paper and gotten excellent results. Similarly, like it's better if you like catch a good astrological election for them. But it is not necessary. You can do them almost any time. Because even though we talk about them as planetary pentacles, they're not really very planetary. Like if you actually look at what is written on them, if you look at like the history of how they were made and used and like how they relate to other kinds of amulets, particularly Hebrew amulets. Like if you've seen Hebrew amulets, then as soon as you look at the planetary pentacles, you're like, oh, this is a kind of a Hebrew amulet. Like there's a way that they are. Like they're just very similar. Like even if you don't read Hebrew, just visually you would look at them and you'd be like, oh, this is clearly like a beginner version of this. Right? Or this is a version of this for people who maybe are not fully Hebrew fluent. Right? Like they just don't have as many words on them. Right? As like ones in the Jewish community have more words.
That makes
and
sense.
Like full sentences.
That makes sense.
In ways that when the Christian manuscripts of Pentacles don't always. But that's something I really like about Solomonic Magick for the most part, right? And like because Solomonic Magick is such a big field, I'm kind of narrowing down now to talk specifically about Solomonic Pentacles, which is what my book is about.
Okay.
Right? I mean, like, but it's also generally true of Solomonic Magick that broadly of those 3 Agrippa categories, it's ideal. And that means you like don't need fancy materia. You don't need fancy astrological elections. Like those are good and they are recommended, but the real power is in the name. It is a magic about magic names and magic words.
Okay. What are the bare bones things you need then? If say somebody wanted to jump in and do this, you would need to make the pentacles, you know, like you said, you could either write them out yourself. Other than that, other than making those or purchasing those, right? What other things would you need if you were to practice Solomonic Magick? Like bare bones, you know, at a minimal.
So let me answer the question. Let me answer the question first, like what I would recommend.
Okay.
But the answer to your question is nothing.
Okay. What
you need is like an ability to speak is knowledge. Solomonic Magick is in its essence like the skillful application of specialized technical knowledge about magic. So what you need to do is know stuff. And I'm not trying to be catty, but I do think that in many ways, people try and substitute buying things for learning things, and that doesn't really work. In terms of props, I love props. Like, don't get me wrong, like, I love mad props. Like, if you, like, I could reach out and show you like 50. This is a Solomonic seal on a wax stamp that I just got in the mail today. Like, I love props. I like them, but none of them are necessary. Bare bones, my method, what you need is a sketchbook, a black pen, probably more than one black pen, maybe
Mhm.
even some colored pencils if you're fancy,
Mhm.
and some candles.
Okay. Okay.
Really, you could
Yeah.
skip the candles. Like if you were in
Okay.
prison or something and you're not allowed to light candles, you could do it without the candles. It'd be like a little bit harder.
Hmm.
Some
Okay.
just a little bit more props. The next prop I would tell people to
Mhm.
get is a big white scarf.
Oh, okay. Why that one?
Um, you can use it for a lot of things. You can use it to like wrap up the magic book,
Hmm.
but basically you take this scarf and you just make the scarf like
Hmm.
a garment of holiness, basically,
Okay.
so that like you can also wear it, right? And it
Okay.
like puts you. It's like putting your fancy magician hat on.
Okay.
But also,
Good.
I like a scarf in particular because it's multi-purpose, right? You can
Hmm.
spread it out on a table, and
Hmm.
suddenly the table is an altar. You can wrap your
Okay.
book up in it to
Hmm.
like keep your book safe, like to create a magic bubble. You can
Hmm.
wear it like a cape. You
Hmm.
can hang it when you wear. I don't have a white one. I do have a white one handy, but it's
Hmm.
like holding up my. It's
Hmm.
wrapping my book actually. So I'm going to show with this yellow one. But like in general, when I wear a scarf for
Hmm.
magic, you want to wear it like way over your head and kind of like
Hmm.
lean down. So
Hmm.
it forces you so you can only see the thing
Hmm.
you're supposed to be looking
Okay. Okay.
at.
That's a
Right?
practical tip.
Yeah,
Mm.
like that's a I think generally when people advocate veils in magic,
Hmm.
that's what they're saying.
Okay.
Which if you look at cultures where like
Hmm.
veils are used in ritual practice, right? So like
Right.
in
Right.
Orthodox Judaism, we have a special kind of a veil, basically called
Right.
a tallis, right? But also like Catholic nuns. If you look at writings about them,
Hmm.
like you'll see that like
Hmm.
they talk about it in more mystic language. So you have to kind of look through. But like if you look at what they're doing, like that's
Right.
how it like it's like putting blinders on a horse, right? Like you can
Right.
only look directly in front of you, so you can only see your altar.
Right. Okay. Okay.
That's another reason I like that scarf.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
But by scarf, I really just mean like a big piece of white fabric.
Okay. Okay.
Like I use that kind of like
Hmm.
scarf because they're a good size and also
Hmm.
they're cheap and
Hmm.
easy to find. And at least where
Hmm.
I live, I will say thrift stores
Hmm.
constantly have them
Yeah.
in like every solid color. So I have one in like every color for different kinds of.
Okay.
I like
Okay.
scarf, but
Um,
I think those are for me. Those are the minimum tools. In principle, you don't even need paper and pencil. You could do it all out loud.
okay.
Again, in principle, you should probably have a Torah or a Bible in a language you can read.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I mean, you could memorize it instead.
Okay.
Like many of the grimoires, it's pretty clear that they're doing it from memory.
Sure.
When
Sure.
they write out holy texts, you can
Hmm.
tell because like when they make mistakes,
Hmm.
they like substitute a synonym. So sometimes there's like spelling
Hmm.
mistakes, but also sometimes there'll be like a Torah verse
Hmm.
that like the actual Torah will say like boat, but
Okay.
the grimoire will say like ship.
Okay.
Is there some mystic meaning? Like sometimes maybe, but really
Hmm.
I think it's just an indication that like
Hmm.
the person composing it is not copying that verse
Hmm. Hmm.
out of Torah. They have memorized it, but
Hmm.
not perfect.
Okay. Okay. Why do you think, you know what I'm very curious about is in the whole like magical sphere, why do you think there's so much like stigma or like Goetia or Solomonic magic is one of the few forms of magic? I mean, if you're getting into, Western esotericism in general, generally you have an open mind, you're very you're not
If only that was true.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's a good point. Okay, fair point, fair point. But it's one of the few areas, I guess you would say, of magic that I find that people are sort of like, you got to be really careful or avoid that, avoid Solomonic magic. It sort of has some sort of stigma or some sort of like warning labels around it. Would you think there's a specific reason? Is that what do you see the reason for that?
Are you asking me why Jewish magic is stigmatized in predominantly
Yeah,
cities?
okay, okay.
Like,
Well,
that's why.
yeah, okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, okay. Because it's a Jewish form of magic rather compared to
I do
other.
think that generally, right, like Jewish things are stigmatized and understood to be
Hmm.
dangerous. But
Hmm.
also, I think that Solomonic magic,
Hmm.
a lot of full systems of magic
Hmm.
right? Like not you learn this, individual pieces, but like
Sure.
a whole full system. A lot of times are initiatory traditions.
Okay, that's a fair point.
But
Okay.
Solomonic magic is not an initiatory tradition.
Ah,
Now, there is an argument to be made that some kinds of Solomonic magic require some kinds of initiation, right? So
okay.
there is an argument made that certain kinds of Christian Solomonic magic do require baptism, which is
Okay.
certainly an initiatory ritual,
Okay.
right? There's some argument, some grimoires, some of the magic, I think,
Hmm.
appears to require like Catholic ordination. Like this is magic only for priests. The
Okay.
Jewish magic, many of the pieces of Solomonic magic,
Hmm.
like in Jewish kinds, you do have to be Jewish to make like
Interesting.
in
Okay.
a respectfulness way, but also
Hmm.
in a like making it work way. Because there's like sometimes you call them like ancestral ties. And you need to like actually
Okay.
have like you'll say like do for me as you did for like
Mhm.
God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of
Mm,
Sarah, blah, 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 right? Do for
right.
me the way you did for my ancestors of old.
Okay.
Like in order to make that work, you do need those answers. But it's easy
Right.
to like you can adapt it. Like this is not
Sure.
an argument about cultural appropriation,
Uh-huh.
right? Which like that horse is out of the barn, right? Like
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
I
Right.
can't argue about that, right? But it's just about like a lot of it is ancestral, and it's not always obvious when like if you're not Jewish and you don't carefully read what is being said,
Sure.
especially when you read it in Christian translation, it's sometimes a little
Mm,
tricky to know
okay.
which pieces those are. But
Okay.
here's one way to tell. If it uses the
Mhm.
phrase our God,
Mm,
not just God, but our God, then
mhm.
you're called like that magic is relying on that ancestral connection. And
Mm,
you will get a better result
mhm.
if you like just adapt it a little bit so you're
Okay.
not doing that. Like so you're calling on like you
Mm,
can swap out the God name. I guess
okay.
you could convert to Judaism. That is an option. But like
Yeah.
I not only do I not particularly recommend that, I
Yeah.
like am religiously obligated to tell you not to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's funny. Okay. That's
Right, but like so there's a little bit of initiation, but I do think that it's like it is a powerful form of magic. It's a
yes.
powerful form of magic that like most magic that passed through Europe
Hmm.
kind of got nerfed.
Okay.
Like they pulled all the power out and
Okay.
you have to like reconstruct back in the power. But
Okay.
Solomonic magic, particularly because it is well preserved in these Hebrew and Arabic traditions,
Hmm.
right? Like that is less the case, right?
Okay.
Also, because it's a very literate magic,
Hmm.
it's much easier to like if you're a bad guy and you want to like ruin a culture, it's much easier to do that with an oral transmission. Like, you know what I mean? Like to cut off
Yeah.
an oral transmission, you only need to murder so many people. But a
Right.
literate
Okay.
tradition is like harder to do that. So it like
Okay.
maintains more of its structural integrity over time. And
Okay.
I think those are some of the reasons that like I think it has a reputation for being dangerous.
Okay.
I do think that like there's a meaningful amount of anti-Semitism in that.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Not just people who are saying it now. Like I don't think they know that that's why. Like they're not doing that. But like
Sure.
historically, it's definitely baked in.
Hmm.
And I also think there's like a blasphemy like
Uh-huh.
hit to it.
Uh-huh.
Like, oh naughty, I'm gonna summon demons that like
Right. Right.
particularly
Right.
for people who grew up Christian, it like hits those buttons.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. I read the
So
book.
that would be my guess as to what, but I think
Yeah.
I would say it's less stigmatized, for example, than many like African diaspora traditions.
Oh, that's a fair point. Okay, I didn't think about it that way
Yeah,
too.
and
Yeah.
why is it that
Yeah.
magic of Jews and black people is the ones people think are dangerous?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think
Yeah.
it's a mystery why
Right.
certain
Right. Right.
traditions are more stigmatized than others.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair point. Fair point. Can you share a little bit about the importance of like having a working relationship with these demons or entities? How do you refer to them again? You use a different name than demon.
People is what I would
Okay.
normally
People.
use.
Okay. Okay.
People.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Uh,
That's fair.
so here's what I will say. In Solomonic magic, I actually don't think that the relationship with those spirits
Okay.
is necessarily the key.
Hmm.
Because there's like kind of a category of spirit on top of that you have a relationship with. And then
Okay.
you're basically employing like an employment contract. You're like hiring
Right. Okay.
demons to do jobs, right? And
Okay.
so you don't necessarily need like
Hmm.
I think you will always get better results out of an
Hmm.
employee you treat well and are friends with and like share common goals with. Like, I
Hmm.
think generally you get better results from a business partner than
Hmm.
you do from a slave.
Yeah.
But
Right.
like the structurally, you're really just hiring them to do a job. Like,
Right.
you do this, I'll give you this. Or
Right.
like, you need to do this because I'm friends with your boss and he's telling you to do it. That's the
Mm.
essential mechanism of Solomonic,
Okay.
right? Is effectively an employment contract. And if you look at like the oldest Solomonic text, it's like that's clearly what is going on,
Mm.
right? Is
Okay.
an employment contract. And that employment contract, particularly when it passes through late medieval or early Renaissance
Hmm.
Christendom,
Hmm.
comes out looking a lot like compulsive slavery. But
Okay.
you have to understand that the feudal warlords
Hmm.
who wrote those texts,
Hmm.
that's also how they treat their employees and their wife and
Right.
their children and literally everyone else in their
Sort
life.
of this sort of commanding kind of language, this sort of, is that
Yeah,
what
like,
you're
do
referring?
this or I'm going to hit you with a big stick. Like, that's
Right.
actually how, that's how noblemen in
Hmm.
like early Renaissance Christendom
Hmm.
treated everyone in their life. So it's
Sure.
not like shocking. Like, it's not a fact about Solomonic magic that they're treating the
Mm.
spirits that way. They
Right.
treat everyone and everything that way.
Right.
And if you look at like Solomonic magic in other cultural contexts,
Hmm.
like the by thread is that it's an employment. Not always.
Mm.
So there are examples of what I would call like conjuration by love,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Where like you call the spirit and you're like, I love you so much. Look at this
Mm.
feast I made for you. I
Yeah.
love you. I love you so much. I know all your secret names.
Right.
Please come and visit me. But that is a less common formulation.
Mm,
But
interesting.
it certainly is a traditional formulation as well.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, another thing I was curious about, what are like the necessary steps? Say you wanted to work with Solomonic Magic, like the opening step one, step two. How many steps do you see in the total that are necessary in the process of successfully doing a working operation?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I just did it and it worked. So I don't know that there are necessarily like stages,
Okay.
but
Okay.
I do think that like, it relies on certain things, right?
Okay.
So things that I think help. I
Hmm.
do think that like essentially I do think that you need a working relationship with the God of Israel
Okay.
because that's
Okay.
like when I say like I know your boss and he says you have to do this, that's the
Mm.
boss you're talking about. Like
Okay.
there are subsidiary bosses like the demon kings, but
Sure.
ultimately you're saying like God says you have to do this.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
Like you
Okay.
made a deal. But then
Right.
there's this subcategory where actually you and Solomon bartered this contract
Yeah. Right.
and
Okay.
I'm just like this is just the contract. Like I'm gonna
Right.
do my bit, you do your bit,
Right.
right? And so essentially, I would say like the key ingredients of Solomonic magic are, which is what I would say are the key ingredients of any magic, is like
Okay.
one, I I think none of these are necessary. Like if you push
Mm.
hard enough on any of these buttons,
Hmm.
right? So one of them is what I would call like witch fire,
Okay.
just like your own internal power that
Okay.
you can
Okay.
just push at a situation.
Right.
Two is like some kind of complex relationship with spirits,
Hmm.
generally with the God of Israel in particular, with
Mm.
Solomon, Magician King in particular,
Okay.
and with like the boss spirits. So, like, for
Mm.
example, the archangels or the demon kings,
Hmm.
etc. Right?
Hmm.
I think that, like I said before, it is a technical understanding of
Hmm.
like this special knowledge. So I do think
Okay.
that like understanding like
Hmm.
why this particular word is used here, understanding why
Mm.
this shape is there, like that
Okay.
kind of technical knowledge, I think is important in all kinds of magic, right? Like
Okay.
I think generally, like again, if you have enough witch fire, especially when you're a teenager, you can
Hmm.
just push hard and make
Yeah.
anything work. Like I also got results from spells I learned from like the Gargoyles TV show.
Right. Right. Right.
Like there's a spell for
Right.
conjuring Puck, like the
Right.
fairy Puck. And I got
Right.
great results with that from that, right? So there's a way to
Right.
like push on it. There's a
Hmm.
way to like be favored on the other side, I
Hmm.
guess,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Like all of those things. But I
Mm.
do think that like technical skill,
Mm.
right? Like it works better if you
I
do
actually
it right.
understand what you're doing and the
Well, like
purpose and stuff.
tentacles they're like magical machines. Let me show a picture of one
Okay.
that I think will make what I'm saying clearer.
Okay.
Okay, so this is like a quite, I would say, typical pentacle. magical
Okay.
in some ways, right? Like
Mhm.
it has some like relatively simple geometry. People would say sacred geometry, but I will tell you as a mathematician, I do not believe in the existence of non-sacred geometry.
It's
Like
all
it's
sacred.
all sacred, it's all geometry, like that's the only kind there is. Which
Yeah.
is also how I feel about like alphabets.
Right.
There's just only sacred alphabets. Those are the only kind, right? So it has some. It's a circle, and it
Hmm.
has like what we call versicle, which is almost
Hmm.
always a Torah verse
Hmm.
around the outside that functions as kind of like a lens,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? It like or like a semi-permeable membrane. It decides like what can get in and out of your circle,
Okay.
right? And then there's like some sacred geometry and some divine names, where basically like you plant some divine names,
Hmm.
sometimes names for the Hebrew names for the God of Israel,
Hmm.
sometimes angel names, occasionally other kinds of names. And you
Okay.
like arrange them in this geometry, the way people would make like a crystal grid,
Okay. Okay.
right? But you arrange them in a certain way
Hmm.
and they do things. And like
Yeah.
if you kind of understand why they were put where they were put,
Hmm.
like I think you bring a lot of extra power to the magic. I think
Okay.
for most people,
Yeah.
that's the easiest piece to remedy.
Okay. Okay.
Like I think the easiest way to get better at Solomonic magic
Hmm.
is just like learn, like understand it better, like understand
Sure.
how it works, why the pieces are where they are.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because but you can definitely make it work by just throwing witch fire at it, because you can make
Mm.
almost any magic work by just throwing enough witch fire at it.
Right. Okay.
But if you're throwing witch fire at a machine that only kind of works, you do not get as good results as if you throw
Hmm.
the same amount of witch fire at at magic that like does probably like the gears actually
Right.
mesh and it turns smoothly. Is kind
Sure.
of how I think about it. Like you just get
Yeah.
better results.
That makes sense.
But
Makes sense.
sometimes you get less special effects. Like a lot of the things
Mm.
we think of as special effects, like when I was a teenager just throwing witchfire things, I would like pop light bulbs all the time,
Okay. Okay.
right? Or like doors would slam, or there would be
Sure.
like a thunderclap. Just
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Little.
little special effects, right? But
Right. Right.
actually, that's just a sign that your magic is sloppy. Like that's all
Okay.
a sign that there's so much friction in your magic that your witchfire is going to do all that
Kind of
nonsense,
shooting off in
but it
different directions
right
and
and
stuff.
not what you are actually
It's not
trying to push
focused.
it
It's
at.
not focused. In other words, yeah.
Exactly,
I get
exactly. So
it.
I actually think you
Yeah.
get a little bit less special effects as you clean up and tighten the magic,
Okay. Okay.
which is
Fair
sometimes
point.
disappointing. Like, right? But like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like when you're just pushing witchfire like a
Yeah.
poltergeist teenager, like
Right.
you get a lot of that kind of like stuff
Yeah. 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 Okay.
happening.
Okay. That's interesting. Can you share actually, I kind of like the way we're going with this too. Can you share some interesting stories about like, these sort of special effects or side effects? And then, maybe like how it went haywire, how maybe one operation went haywire, and then maybe another story where like the opposite, where it was just super focused and sort of the results that came from that using
Okay,
Solomonic
so
magic in specific. Yeah.
this is one of the first quasi Solomonic magic spells I
Okay.
cast.
Hmm.
I don't know that I would exactly call it Solomonic magic, but it's like in
Uh-huh.
that zone.
Uh-huh.
So my friend has come home. So again, I'm in ninth grade in this story,
Hmm.
right? And my friend took the bus home with me. So we're at my house
Hmm.
hanging out. And we have a trigonometry test coming up
Hmm.
that we do not want to take. So we want it to snow.
Hmm.
Now, we live in Pennsylvania and it's January. So it's like not maybe February. It's like
Hmm.
not that hard to make it snow in Pennsylvania, right?
Okay.
It's snowing right now,
Sure.
right? But okay, so we organize a little snow spell, right?
Hmm.
So we like dug through my mom's pantry and found this like snowflake shaped candle. Why
Okay.
did my mom have a snowflake shaped candle? I assume it was a gift from like
Right.
a cousin or something. I don't like that's not the sort of thing my mom would normally have. But it was I
Right.
don't know, we like rummaged through the pantry and found some like winter smelling herbs, basically,
Okay.
right? And then we like thought about like some like winter spirits and like built basically a circle, right? So we have a
Okay.
candle in the middle and we like arranged these spirit
Hmm.
tokens, right? So we like write out their name or
Hmm.
their seal, right?
Hmm.
On pieces around the candle. And then we had like a circle of like herbs. And
Hmm.
then we got naked and danced around it until, because that's what teenage witches do. I don't know.
Right.
Like, right? We danced around it in circles for a while, like build up power, chanting snow,
Okay.
right? And we like really visualize, because we didn't really know what we were doing, but told you to like visualize results, right?
Hmm.
So we
Hmm.
like visualize like mountains and mountains of snow. Okay.
Hmm.
Well, my mom calls down for us to come to dinner, right? So we go
Yeah.
eat dinner. Then we all watch Star Trek together because that's the kind
Uh-huh.
of nerd home I grew up in. And then it's time for my friend to go home, and it's still not snowing.
Yeah.
Notice that we did not at any point in the story study for our trig exam.
Yeah.
No, we're both. I mean, we're both really good at math. That's how we were friends. Like, that's
Yeah.
why we're both in trigonometry. Like in this
Yeah.
story, which like we're younger than everybody else in our trig class, which is
Right.
how we like she and I became BFFs, is we were like the only ninth graders in this class, right? But we did not study at any point,
Mhm.
right? So she goes home, and I'm
Mhm.
like, oh, I guess it didn't work, right? And I clean up the spell because it's like in the middle of my bedroom floor,
Mhm.
right? So I put it like I pack it all away,
Mhm.
and the next morning we wake up, and there is like a foot of snow, and it did not stop snowing for a week and a half.
Wow. Wow.
And so that was a really like early, and that was when we were like, oh, this is like, because I talked to her, and like both of us,
Mhm.
when we visualized the result we wanted, we
Mhm.
didn't visualize the result we wanted. We visualized a crazy blizzard, like the most snow we could conceivably imagine.
Right,
That
right,
was
right.
not actually what we were trying to do.
Right, right. You didn't create a
So
limitation or a,
we
specific,
just didn't.
basically.
The thing we imagined was not what we wanted. Like
Okay.
what we imagined was a much inflated because we
Right,
didn't really think it was going to work. We
right,
didn't necessarily think this was going to work.
right, right, right.
Kinda did, but I definitely thought we better think snow as hard as we can. Now, I will say, like, as a grown up magician,
Mhm.
there are particular reasons why, like, the two of us together
Mhm.
are, like, particularly like, both of us have a
Mhm.
family history of weather working magic,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
both Pisces. Like,
Mhm.
we're doing this on the land we were born in, that we have, like, this
Mhm.
really deep connection to. So, like, there are reasons why, like, we would
Mhm.
get particularly strong weather results.
Right, right, right,
But
right.
anyway, so that's like an early story of like
Okay.
results from that, I guess.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. Um, have there been what would you say is like? I mean, I know this is kind of a weird perspective, but like, what do you think your success rate? Do you see a higher success rate with Solomonic magic as opposed to other forms, or does it really depend on what you're hoping to achieve with what you're doing?
Well, again, I think as a practicing magician,
Uh-huh.
I am rarely doing only a very specific, the only
Okay.
time
Hmm.
I'm going to like narrow down and do a very specific, like, this is exactly the way it is in the book
Hmm. Hmm.
magic. The
Hmm.
only time I'm going to do that is like the first couple times I'm learning it.
Hmm.
Or when I'm writing a book, I do like, you know what I mean? When you write a cookbook,
Hmm.
you do have to make the
Yeah,
recipe exactly the way it is going to be in your book, but that's not
sure.
actually how cooks normally cook.
Sure. Okay, that's a
Right. And similarly, as a magician, I'm not normally doing like super only Solomonic magic. So I think it's hard to say. I
hmm.
do think that like I have a taste, like I think I am particularly good at this kind of magic
Hmm.
relative to some things that I'm just not very good at. I'm trying to think like rocks,
Okay.
like crystals.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't get it. I don't like many magicians I work with, like my godmother makes these really elaborate crystal grids,
Hmm.
and she gets amazing like quasi miraculous results out of them,
Hmm.
but I just don't get it. Like I can't make rocks do that.
All right.
I don't understand how I mean, I can get results from it, but
Uh-huh.
again, really, I'm
Hmm.
maybe just throwing witch fire at the world. Like, I'm not sure. I think when I do
Yeah.
crystal magic, if you removed the crystal, it would have worked just as well. I don't
Right.
think I'm actually using the crystal at all. It's just a
Right.
prop. Right. And I think for everybody, there's just like kinds you're good at and kinds you're bad at.
Hmm.
Why am I bad at rocks?
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean,
Mm.
my godmother, I imagine, who I was
Mhm.
saying that might suggest that is because I dismissively refer to them as rocks, whereas demons I
Yeah.
referred to as people. And
Ah,
perhaps
okay.
if I treated the rocks like people, they would be more inclined to like me. If I had to make a guess, I think that's what she would say. I will
Okay.
say she is generally of the opinion that most people are either rock people
Mhm.
or plant people, and
Mm.
not usually both. And I am definitely a plant person.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like,
That makes a lot of sense.
that
When
friend
you,
I mentioned in that snow spell,
yeah.
she's a professor of botanical medicine now. So like
Oh,
even if I wasn't by nature going to be a plant person, like
right.
because my early co-magician, like the
Uh-huh.
whole time learning magic, I was doing it with like a very serious herbalist.
Right. So
So
I
I know a
put
lot about plants.
the extra power into it and stuff like that. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. You refer to them as people. Do you think there's any difference between like, are there any major differences between how you would treat a relationship with the spirits versus actual people? Or do you see a big distinction there?
By actual people, do you mean humans?
Yeah, humans, yeah.
I mean, yeah, obviously, like the way I deal with humans is deeply informed by the fact that they and I both have bodies,
Okay. Yeah.
that we
Yeah. Yeah.
speak the same language, that
Right.
like I mean, like,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm not, yes, I have a lot of complicated relationships with humans that are
Sure.
like
Sure. Sure.
built about our humanness, our shared humanness,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
In a
Uh-huh.
different way. But like, generally, I think it's best to treat, okay, let me see if I can do this in a nerd way.
Mhm.
Okay, so like, let me do a non-nerd way first, right? As an
Okay.
animist, the same way I would teach it to like a toddler,
Uh-huh.
like you should treat people like they're people.
Hmm.
Like that tree is alive, it's a person, you should treat it like a person. If
Hmm.
you're not sure if something has feelings or not, you should just treat it like it has feelings,
Mm,
right?
good
But
advice.
another way to say that, like that's also Kant's first categorical imperative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is treat people like people and not like objects. So it's like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
How exactly does he say it as an end unto themselves and not a means? Maybe I don't know exactly how Kant says it, but that's the
Right.
first
I know what you mean.
categorical
Yeah.
imperative, basically,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And so, but that for me is like in some sense a piece of
Hmm.
magician advice, but
Hmm.
it's really like an ethical piece of advice,
Okay.
that it's like better to treat things like people, because
Hmm.
I think even casual observation of the world we live in
Sure.
indicates that most people not only like don't treat Earth that way and other living
Mhm.
creatures, they don't even treat other human beings that way.
Yeah, that's a fair
And
point.
that is literally ruining the world. Like
Right.
you can watch it ruin the world in real time. So that's really like a piece of more like ethical advice than it is.
Sure. Sure.
Like you can definitely do Solomonic magic
Hmm.
while treating the spirits like slaves. Like I'm not saying it
Okay.
won't work.
Okay.
I'm just saying it's like morally repugnant and you shouldn't do it. Like
Right.
it's
Okay.
like you wouldn't think that my position that slavery is wrong would be like a hot take, but that is my position.
Right.
Enslaving things is wrong and you shouldn't do it.
Right. Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. Yeah. That's good advice. That's good advice. A frequent listener, a good friend of mine, and a frequent listener to
Mm-hmm.
the show, who's been a guest here a few times. He's a big fan of your Orphic hymns book, so maybe we can kind of transition and talk a little bit about that. Can you share a little bit how you? Yeah. There we go. Here we go. Sweet. 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 Can you share how you got into that, like transitioning? Because you started out kind of from Solomonic Magic, even as a very young kid, reading the Ritual Magic book. How did this impetus come about?
So like I said, like my mom's Jewish and my dad's Greek. So I definitely
Okay.
grew up like drenched in I definitely grew up understanding the gods of ancient Greece to be the gods of my father's people,
Mm.
exactly the same way that I understood the God of Israel to be the God of my mother's
Okay.
family.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
like I got both of them. Awesome.
Right.
Right? Like
Right.
and Orphism and Solomonic magic are in some sense very similar
Okay.
historically. They grow out of the same time period
Hmm.
and the same influences, right? So like Solomonic magic in some ways is like Hebrew
Hmm.
theology
Hmm.
wrapped up with Greek sorcery.
Hmm. Hmm.
But Orphism in many ways is about Jewish and more broadly like Eastern, by which in this context I mean east of Greece, like Middle Eastern
Hmm.
and Anatolian and
Hmm.
particularly like Levantine theological influences
Hmm.
into like Greek religion, right? Like they're a very similar sort of mixture. They have that same vibe, right?
Okay.
So I don't know when I first encountered the Orphic hymns. I
Hmm.
think we had a copy at home when I was a kid. Like I'm pretty
Okay.
sure my dad was Greek and my dad was like really into being Greek.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Like so my dad was not an immigrant, like he was born in America, but like if you've seen that like My Big Fat Greek Wedding
Yeah.
show where
Yeah.
the dad is like give me a word, that's my dad. Like I
Yeah.
mean it's a
Okay.
caricature but a very recognizable character, so we
Right.
had a lot of like Greek classics at home.
Okay.
And I think we probably did have the Orphic hymns. Like I'm
Hmm.
reasonably confident that I grew up when the Orphic hymns. Like
Hmm.
it was a
Hmm.
book that was in the house. Not it's like a
Hmm.
religious devotion, but it was a book we had in the house. And
Right.
we didn't have a TV for a long time, and there wasn't an
Right.
internet.
Right.
And I was a nerd, and the other kids didn't like me, so there really wasn't that much to do other than read books. So I read a lot,
Right.
right? Um, and so they'd sort of always been
Hmm.
there. I really liked them. I liked the poetry.
Hmm.
Thomas Taylor is awesome, by the way. Like, I don't think people know that somebody should write, like, if you're listening to this, please, somebody write like a
Hmm.
biography of Thomas Taylor
Okay.
called Taylor the Pagan by his contemporaries, by the way. rumor had gossip, like malicious gossip about him by other classicists, was that he sacrificed a goat in his yard every time he finished a new translation. I'm not saying that's true. That was like something people who were trying to like slander his name said, but it gives you a sense that maybe that guy's awesome. So so I'd heard his translations, but as I read more and more, like as I became more conversant with Greek history and like Greek mythology, sometimes I would read something in these hymns and I'd be like, ooh, that doesn't seem like something somebody in ancient Greece would say. Seems like something a Victorian dude would have said. Like, like it had a very distinctly like sort of, 1800s British guy. I'm like, vibe to it, right? And so I started digging into the Greek, right? And I discovered that, like, yeah, no, that's true. That's not exactly what that says, right? Or that's not how I would interpret it, which is not like about the Taylor translations, right? Sometimes people ask me, like, oh, are your Orphic hymns translations literal? And like, I don't think they understand what poetry is if they are asking that question. Like, no, a translation of poetry is never literal. That fully misses, like, no one would ever claim that a translation of poetry was literal. That fully misses the point of what poetry is, especially sacred poetry. But sometimes you just hear this bias in it about that, right? So I started digging and I started to publish them on Facebook, and people were like, more. And I was like, will you give me money for more? And shocking. And I just on a whim one night, like I was up late. I was like, make a Kickstarter. And I did not expect that to work.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like I was just like, maybe this will work. But like if you go and look at that Kickstarter page, you will see that I whipped it together in like an hour and a half at like 2:00 in the morning because I was hot. people really want me to do this, like, oh, let's see if they made it. And they did.
Well, that's awesome. And so that's actually how that book came to be originally.
That was my first book. That's how that came in. I was actually working on a book about the Titans at that point.
Oh, interesting. Okay, interesting.
I started doing Orphic hymns translations because I was like working with Titans in particular.
Okay. How do you
one day I will write a Titans.
The hymns it seems like you kind of like you take the best elements of like different. You said you don't really, in your own personal practice, you don't use like rigidly, I just practice the Solomonic Magick step by step. You kind of take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right?
Yes, like, but also that's what Solomonic Magick does. Like, if you look at a Solomonic grimoire, that's what they're doing too. They're like, oh, I took this piece of this and this piece of that, and I've built it together. Like that is that is what Solomonic Magick is. Like that is what Orphism is. The kinds of magic I'm drawn to are these very like syncretic practices that are a little stigmatized. In ancient Greece, Orphism was deeply stigmatized. That was I think Plato calls it, like that Orphism is for like women, slaves, foreigners, and other undesirables. Like, oh, he means me. He means me. That's me, right? But like, it also has that sort of outsidery kind of crossroadsy influence to it. So that's what I would say is like Solomonic Magick is doing that, and Orphism is doing that. And so I can look at these historical snapshots, but like a living Solomonic magician today who is practicing magic as if it is 1720, in my opinion, is fundamentally failing at doing. Like Solomon would not approve of that.
Right.
No, because like if you read Talmud, the rabbis are constantly shitting on Solomon for introducing all these new foreign practices. Like they're mad. Like conservatives do not like Solomon for doing that. Like that's the essence of Solomonic Magick. And similarly, Orphism, right, is this really syncretic like religion that's taking in all these foreign elements and mixing them together into a coherent whole. And so like I think I'm just continuing to do that. And particularly, I will say Orphism and Solomonic Magick because they share quite close, like cultural foundations. Okay, like they're very easy to mesh together because there's 1,000. Like my meshing together of like Greek magic and Jewish magic has thousands of years of well-documented history.
Okay, yeah,
which is not to say you can't mix together like Norse whatever, and like Afro-Caribbean practices. You're just gonna have to think about it, and like. We see that, right? Like there are plenty of places and people who are doing that. It's just maybe you have to think about it a little harder because there's less shared history to like build that out of. And not just shared history, but shared like aesthetic values, if that makes sense. Like Hebrew poetry and Greek poetry, like they share certain kinds of aesthetic emphasis that like we inherit in our culture. right? That our poetry is also built out of that like biblical poetry and that ancient Greek poetry. So that like if you take Homer and the Bible and put them in a blender,
yeah,
like we actually all know what that sounds like. That's like right. And that's
right.
that's all the things that I'm into are vaguely in that category.
Yeah, that makes
No,
sense.
that's not true. Sometimes I'm into like other weird, wild stuff.
Right, right, right. Well, your take is very refreshing considering like if you look online, there's all these like what do you call them?
Like we call them a
Grimoire.
grimoire
I would just
bro.
say Grimoire bros, right? I think that's a term. Or like where it's like, no, you have to follow just step by step, and it's like there's no sense of like originality or making something your own
That
or
is historic.
yeah.
I think it's like silly.
Like Control C, Control V approach
But
or something like that. Yeah.
yeah. But also like they read that. Like when people tell me, like,
Mhm.
oh, I did it exactly the way the book says, I'm
Mhm.
like, well, on page 14, it says this. And on page 27, it says the exact opposite of that. And at
Right.
this point in the ritual, if you're doing it exactly the way it says, you need
Right.
3 hands. So, like, honestly, when I hear people tell me they did it exactly by the book,
Mhm.
I am suspicious that they did it at all.
Okay. Okay.
Like, I'm not saying all of them are liars. I'm just saying, like, the books are actually not, like,
Mhm.
they're not the easiest instructions to follow.
Right. 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 Okay, that makes sense.
But also, I just think that that is not the intention of that book.
Mhm.
I think that is not the intention. There is no field in the world.
Mhm.
Like, if there was a chef who
Mhm.
told me, like, oh, I only cook exactly by the recipe in other people's cookbooks,
Mhm.
I wouldn't really respect them either.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that
Like,
makes
I
sense.
just
Yeah.
don't think that's like a
Yeah.
correct way to do things.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
like
Yeah, I agree. I
some
agree.
people would say magic is an art and not a science. But I
Mhm.
feel like they're saying that because they don't know what science is. Like, if a scientist told me, oh, I did it exactly the way it was in this other book, I'm like, cool, but that's not sciencing. Like, you've missed the point.
Right. 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 Right.
And that is my feeling about magic as well. But, like,
Mhm.
the goal, like, there's value in learning things deeply. So
Sure.
there is, like, I understand what they're fighting against. What they're fighting
Mhm.
against is, like, oh, I just looked at the pictures
Mhm.
and then made something up.
Mhm. Mhm.
But
Mhm.
you know what? I would so much rather have a student or just
Mhm.
like a human being interact with another magician who
Mhm.
looked at the pictures and then did something versus
Mm.
someone who like read every footnote for 15 years but never fucking does anything.
Right. 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 Right.
Right? So I do like I understand where that like gatekeepy kind of thing comes from because a lot of people say a lot of stupid shit. Like a
Sure.
lot of people say a lot of dumb shit about magic that
Sure.
like is just dumb. Like it's a thing that I see on the internet a lot of times is like you can substitute rosemary for any other herb.
Mhm.
And I'm like, my brother in witchcraft, you cannot. Like, would you, if somebody was cooking for you and they said that, would
Yeah.
you eat anything they cooked? Because I wouldn't. Like,
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I mean, like, I understand where that impulse comes from because like the fact that I'm saying there's no singular correct way, I'm not
Mm.
saying that every way's correct. There's a whole lot of wrong ways. Like many ways
Right.
are wrong. They don't work. They're stupid.
Right.
Or, right, like the way I was doing it as a kid, where you're just throwing witch fire at things, which
Mhm.
like you just it's not good for you. Like it's not physically. If you look
Mhm.
around at the sort of
Mhm.
magicians who do that,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
if anybody listening to this, think about like magicians that you know
Yeah.
who are like in their 60s now
Yeah.
or older. The ones who do magic where they're just throwing power at things,
Mhm.
aren't they actually 15 years older than other people their age?
Mm.
Like it's just like you as a human, I do not have an infinite supply of that power.
Right.
Like it's not good for your body. Not
Right.
only that, I will say if you know them well, I can almost guarantee that specifically they have some endocrine problems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're taxing
It
your
just blows
system.
out your it's just not good. I mean it's clearly just not good for you. And that's what every traditional magic on earth says. Is that that
Right.
kind of wild magic is just
Uh-huh.
not good for you and you should learn to do it less sloppy. Because
Mhm.
all those like sparks that are flying out and popping light bulbs,
Mhm.
that's also happening in your body. Like you're also popping
Mhm.
capillaries.
Right, right, right. That's a good
It's
point.
just
You're
not good
using,
for you.
yeah, yeah, you're using a lot of your body, your strength, your internal, like you said
Yeah.
earlier, your internal energies in these processes.
Right.
So,
And like there's
yeah.
nothing wrong with that if you especially if you have like a strong internal energy cultivation practice.
Sure, sure, sure.
But you know, if you like the sort of people that I'm talking, sort of people who are like, rosemary is good as any other herb,
Right.
I can say with some confidence, do not have a strong internal energy practice.
Right. Right. Well, you made a good
Those are
point.
not the sort of people who are spending an hour a day doing Qigong. I'm pretty sure.
Right, 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 right. I was going to say that you probably see a lot of value in practicing something like a qigong or a yoga or other things like that in this in actually
Yeah.
magic itself, right?
I think that's good for, I mean, I think that's just good generally for all humans, but
Yeah, your life
particularly
in
for
general.
magicians.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I will also say that, like, remember how I was saying that my herbalist friend,
Hmm.
because I did magic with her, I like learned a lot of herbalism. Well, one of my other like BFF co-magicians
Hmm.
is a very serious martial artist who does a lot of that kind of internal practice, like Bagua and
Hmm.
Tai Chi. And
Hmm.
so, like, even though I am a lazy slob, I do a
Hmm.
surprising amount of Qigong for somebody who's a lazy slob. Like, I don't look like somebody who's like doing a lot of yoga, and I am not, but I
Right.
am definitely doing like the energy cultivation
Okay.
practices,
That's
like
awesome.
more than I otherwise would. And like, I think that's really the single piece of advice I would give beginner magicians is to get some co-magicians. Like a co-magician is more
Mm.
valuable than a teacher,
Okay.
more valuable than anything are co-magicians because without a co-magician, it's really easy to like swing like a pendulum between like I'm a master magician who's like the master of the universe and just like fully deluding yourself. And then you
Mm.
swing down to the other end where you're like, I'm just totally delusional and none of this is real. But if you
Mm.
have co-magicians,
Hmm.
like like the person I told that snow story about,
Hmm. Hmm.
she's heard me tell that story in public. She's never been like, yo, bitch, that did not happen. Right? Which
Right.
she would, right? Like she'll
Right.
call me on it. And on the other end
Mhm.
too, when you're like, it's all delusional, she'll be like, I was there that time in the graveyard when blah 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 blah.
Right.
Right?
Right. Right.
Like,
Right.
and so, and I also think having a co-magician, especially a co-magician who like does things differently than you do,
Okay. Okay.
it forces you to like explain in like it's really easy to think you understand something,
Okay.
but then you try and explain it and you discover that you do not understand it at all. But
Okay.
having a co-magician like forces you to be able to
Hmm.
explain it
Hmm.
in someone else's vocabulary, right? Over time, you build this shared vocabulary,
Hmm.
but like there's still like even these magicians I've been working with for more than 20 years, like
Yeah.
they still have their own point of view, and we still have to like code switch between like
Right.
their magic and my magic,
Right.
right? Between each other. And I think that process,
Hmm.
like it really hones skill. So
Okay.
I really think a co-magician, especially ideally a co-magician that like you can hold their hand and
Hmm.
like share their breath.
Sure. You're very comfortable with.
Like,
Mhm.
well, that, but also you're like physically in the same location casting magic together,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Like, there's some value in having like Zoom
Sure.
co-magicians,
Sure.
but there is no substitute. Nothing else in magic
Hmm.
is a substitute for a live human co-magician in the room with you,
Mm.
especially like over time, like the same co-magician over and over and over.
Right.
I just
Right.
think
Right.
that's my single piece of advice is to get co-magicians as fast as you can. And
Hmm.
they don't have like as you don't have to agree with them.
Hmm.
You don't the only thing you need is for them to be like generally decent human beings. Like
Okay.
I'm not gonna tell somebody to keep a co-magician who like is abusing them or is like
Yeah, right.
obviously just a terrible human. They're a
Right.
bad
Right.
influence on you. But
Right.
like you don't need to agree about how magic works.
Okay.
Like you don't need to agree. You need to like compromise to build the specific magic you're going to do together.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
need to make it work for everybody. Or I'll say in my coven, sometimes
Hmm.
we just take turns. Like
Okay.
I write this ritual, you write this ritual, and you can veto something. But
Hmm.
like there's definitely a difference in style between like a ritual I write and a ritual like
Hmm.
I don't want to name names in my coven because they're
Sure.
not
Sure.
all
Sure.
public
Hmm.
the way I am. But like right the way like person A writes one
Hmm.
or person B writes one. Like
Hmm.
there's differences in style,
Sure.
both in like the writing style and just the way they set things up
Sure.
and etc. Right.
Right. Right. Right.
But I just think that's so valuable. Like that kind of
Yeah.
cross training
Cross
with
training.
other magicians. I think like, yeah. And
Right.
some people, maybe that's not for everybody. Like some people pick one thing and go super deep.
Okay.
And
Okay.
there's nothing wrong with that. But even for them, I think they need other human beings involved.
Okay. That's a fair point. Do you think there
Need
is
is a strong word. It they would benefit from.
there a benefit? Are there any operations you would say that you absolutely need other people with? Like another
Yeah, lots there are
magician?
lots of kinds. you know, most of the time when you have more than one magician in an operation,
Mm-hmm.
like when an operation requires more than one magician, it's
Sure.
because you're going to divide labor. And
Sure.
usually what that means is that like one person is going to be super deep in trance, maybe even
Right.
fully possessed.
Right. Right. Right.
And then the other person is going to be like keeping track of shit in the like normal world and
Right.
taking some notes. And
Right.
like, you know, when you're doing it all by yourself, there's just a limit to how
Mm-hmm.
deep a trance you can get because you still have to like not choke to death or like
Right.
set your house on fire or like
Right.
remember what is happening. And like,
Right.
you know, there are ways to substitute that. I will say I often
Mm-hmm.
pre-record for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I will like sort of write, I guess what we call like a guided meditation kind of script, but
Okay.
I'll write it in advance and record it for myself
Right.
in advance with the time, especially when I have to hit specific astrological timing, which I
Okay.
find quite difficult when I'm in trance. And I don't just want an alarm going off in the middle of my ritual because it
Right.
like shocks me out, right? So I'll like write this guidance and I'll be like, now prepare to do this.
Right.
But like in my own voice.
So recording it and then playing it back while you're
Yeah,
doing
I record it in advance when I'm
like
like,
you
and I
said,
like
kind of like a
script it
guided
out.
meditation almost in a way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have the timing exact in that. Like I edit the audio until the timing's perfect.
Okay.
Like especially, you know,
Makes
sometimes
sense,
like
yeah.
astrological talismans, you only have like a 4-minute window to get a
Mhm.
specific kind of thing done.
Mhm.
And that's pretty hard, at least for me.
Mhm.
I find it difficult to like be in magical consciousness and watching a clock at the same time.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
So
Yeah,
like, and that's what I mean. Like, you know, you can, but like when there's two people,
Mhm.
even better. Right. So
Mhm.
like that's what I'm saying. I often make those recordings of myself
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
like kind of substitute for
Mhm.
not having a second person.
Sure. 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 Well, that makes sense.
But
Mhm.
it's not as good. And I will
Yeah.
say, I'm going to say this isn't a question you asked.
Mhm.
I recommend against using guided meditations in other people's voices
Okay.
too often.
Okay. Okay.
Like you can like they're kind of like training wheels.
Sure. Sure.
Like if you do it always with the same person's voice, first of all, I think it trains you to open up your subconscious to random people on the internet you don't even know, which I'm too
Mm.
paranoid to do. Like I don't take commands from other people. Thank you very much.
Right. It creates a
Right.
dependence in a way, right?
It depends. And also
Mhm.
there are recordings. So there's this one recording by like Andrea Vitamis that I really liked.
Okay.
And I used it all the time. And then I met Andrea Vitamis
Okay.
and it was weird. Like I had like spent years conditioning myself to simply obey hypnotic commands from that
Oh, that's
voice.
hilarious. That's hilarious.
And it was very noticeable when I met him.
Okay. That's interesting.
Like,
Okay. That's some good
also,
advice,
when you,
actually. Yeah. Mm.
so for yourself, like, I know for me, like when they're like, breathe in, breathe out, I'm like, why are we breathing so fast? Slow down. Like, because everybody's different, right? Like, I just
Right.
generally think they're too fast for me.
Right. Okay, that's very good advice. Yeah. I've heard
So I really like to make my own because you get to
Yeah.
make the exact words you want. So with
Yeah.
less words. So these guidance I make for myself, a lot of times there's like 20 minutes of just like background music, like light music or like rain noise or something relevant.
Yeah, you can
Like there's
end
some
it.
beginning, but there's a lot of big. That's another thing I don't like about guided meditations. They're like,
Okay.
now talk to your fairy guide. And then like 30 seconds later, they're talking to me and I'm like, shut up, I'm trying to listen to fairies.
Right. They're rushed
And
oftentimes, yeah.
Yeah, so I really like, it's not that I never use them. I like to listen to them to like get ideas.
Sure.
Right. So I'll do it like once or twice.
Okay.
But then I want to like take it apart and think about what pieces of I like, and I just write my own and record them in my own voice.
Right.
And then it's exactly the way I want it.
No, that's perfect. That reminds me of a good tip I got a long time ago when I was doing Enochian, which is that if you're not using a scryer, right? If you don't have two people, then sort of recording the Enochian call in your own voice, and then you can listen back to it, and then you're able to scry in your own voice,
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So it's like you're using yourself as the scryer, if that makes sense, or the
yeah, exactly, right?
Call,
and that's,
yeah.
Right, but it's still better to have two people.
Yeah, for sure.
Like you can go, you just get, it's just easier. Like there's just a limit to how deep you can go without a buddy, basically.
Sure.
To like
you can
totally
fully let go all the way. Yeah. That makes sense.
Even if it's mostly psychological, I will say.
Right. Well, it's kind of like psychedelics, right? Like what do they call it? Setter. I think that's what it was called, right? Yeah.
Like a sitter, usually.
Sitter,
but
yeah.
like setting sitter, I think is what we often say.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that is true for magic as well. But for magic, like it's not so much you want a sitter, like they have other roles,
Sure, sure.
particularly in things like there's a kind of Solomonic education, right? Where
Mhm.
like one person, you're gonna call a spirit into the medium. So they're gonna get
Mhm.
possessed
Okay.
and like talk with that mouth.
Okay.
And somebody has to ask the question, like in
Mhm.
order to get a conversation,
Mhm.
like you need a second person for that,
Okay.
really. It's quite hard to do that kind of, you can do it kind of with automatic writing yourself,
Okay.
but
Okay.
like I just think it's a lot
Mhm.
easier and also more fun. Like
Sure.
also
Sure.
co-magicians make it way more fun,
Yeah.
and you get all those like analysis and validation, like, oh, how did you experience it, how, and all of those things.
Okay. Okay. That's cool. That's
So yeah,
okay.
I love that.
All right. What about are there any other like so we talked about your two previous books. Are there any other books you're working on or any other current projects that you can share with
So
us? Yeah.
yeah, so in October, this coming
Oh.
October,
Mhm.
Introduction to Witchcraft, 13 Lessons in Practical Magic
Oh,
is
nice.
coming out from Crossed Crow Books. It's
Okay.
with my editor right now. It's
Okay.
very similar. It's like, for me, most of my books, not Orphic hymns, but I say most,
Hmm.
some of my books. The Solomon book, there's
Hmm.
also a course that goes with it. But
Okay.
I taught the course for many years before I wrote the book, which
Okay.
is, see, people sometimes go the other direction, but that seems weird to me because, like, in academia, you
Hmm.
would definitely teach a course a bunch of times before you wrote a textbook for it. Because you
Right.
kind of
It
like
allows you to
bang out.
refine, continually refine and,
Exactly,
distill,
because in a
distill,
course you get
distill.
like real time feed. At least the way I
Right.
run courses, like there's
Right.
students on the Zoom who are talking to me and asking questions and
Hmm.
answering questions that I ask them. Right? There's like a feedback element. Then in a book,
Yeah.
so in a course, I'm
Yeah.
much more willing to be like experimental
Right. Right.
because like they know me. So if I make a mistake, they'll be like, that seems dumb, Sarah. And I'm like, oh yeah, that is dumb.
Right.
Right. But also, like, if later I find out I was wrong,
Hmm.
my ability to correct a book very low,
Yeah.
lower than you would think. No, I will say, like, I actually don't know why I
Right.
can't write to the publisher and be like, hey, on this book's website, can we put up a thing like on page 16 it says blah blah blah, but it should say no.
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's on my website, those kind of little mistakes. But I'm
Uh-huh.
quite careful about books in a
Hmm.
way that in a course,
Hmm.
like I feel more free to be open. And
Right.
if we're just shooting the shit in my living room, I feel
Sure.
much more free to be open.
Sure. Sure.
Right.
Hmm.
So Introduction to Witchcraft is a course I've been teaching.
Hmm.
I think I first year I taught it was 2017, maybe.
Okay. So quite a while. Okay. Hmm.
Yeah, but I taught it in person, and then
Hmm.
pandemic hit and I started teaching on
Mm.
Zoom, and it
Okay.
immediately became obvious to me, like, oh, if I'm going to do this on Zoom,
Uh-huh.
they don't need to live in this city. Like I can just open this to everyone.
Okay. Hmm.
And career-wise, that was great.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Sure.
There's a limited
Mhm.
number of people in Pittsburgh who
Right.
want to take a course,
Right.
and even less of them can pay for it. And
Right.
like I always have like payment plans and scholarships. Like I've never turned a student away because they couldn't afford it.
Right.
But I do need some critical mass of people to pay for things
Sure.
in
Sure.
order for me to do it. Like,
Operational
right.
costs and everything. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like I have a life. Like I am
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
I'm fine, I'm comfortable, but I'm not like
Hmm.
inherited wealth. I don't need to ever make money again, kind of life.
Right. Right.
Right.
Right. Right. Right. Yeah.
So, right. So the Solomon book also grew out of a course. So the Introduction to Witchcraft course and book, the book will be out in October. The course is running now. But I mean that book's basically, from my end, that book's
Well,
basically
that's
done.
good to hear
Like
because
it's
it
with my
means
editor.
the books are based on real life experience, real life practice,
Oh yeah.
as opposed to just. I mean, I'm not shitting on theoretical approaches or historical things, but it's based on actual practical stuff,
Yeah,
that you employ.
nerd about the history and the
Yeah,
scholarship, but
yeah, yeah.
I also feel like you need that practice.
Sure.
For me, here's what I will say. I think I am a good magician, but
Hmm.
like, not to brag, I think I'm a world-class expositor of magic. Like,
Mm.
I think I can take complicated things and make them seem approachable and simple.
Hmm.
I think I'm good at that. Like, I used to teach calculus, like I used to teach
Oh,
math for a
wow.
long time.
Okay. Okay.
So I think like, and similarly, like I was a fine mathematician.
Okay.
Like I was
Okay.
a perfectly acceptable theoretical mathematician, but
Hmm.
I was a world-class expositor of mathematics. Like the awards I won
Hmm.
for math papers were never because my math was brilliant. It was like,
Mm.
oh, this is such a good explanation.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you
So
feel that really helped you a lot in your magical teaching and magical career as well.
I think I just love teaching. Like I do think
Okay,
of like
in
teaching
general,
as like my
yeah. Hmm.
like calling in the world.
Sure, sure,
Right.
sure. Your
And so I teach
passion.
different
Yeah.
things, including, and I mean, I love magic and I love teaching magic, but I do think that like, I think a lot of people teach magic, but really what they're doing is just talking about magic. And sometimes they're doing it in an entertaining way, but then you get to the end of the video and you're like, huh, I still don't know how to do that thing they were supposed to be teaching me how to do.
Yeah.
So I really do try and focus on like, my goal really is to like, whenever I start designing a course, which is the first stage of designing a book, right? I really think to myself, what can someone do after reading this book that they couldn't do before they read this book?
Okay.
And then I go backwards from there, like, well, what do I have to explain to make them be able to do that?
Right,
So like the Pentacle book, I wrote the second half of the book, which is the like real deep nerd shit about pentacles. I wrote that first.
Okay.
And then I read it and I was like, oh, this needs an on-ramp. So then I wrote another 100 pages of like introduction to Solomonic Magick, like introduction to the way I do Solomonic Magic, which I call the SLM method.
You call
for
what?
Solomon. SLM, which is my initials. It's also like Samuel Little Mather's initials. It's also in Hebrew like Solomon. Shin Lamed Mem is the original. But it also sits an acronym. It stands for like the 3 pillars of my approach to Solomonic Magic, which is 1, Solomon. So I talked about that, like, right? Language. I talked about that, like how this is a like magic word. And then magic. Like magic is actually fucking for real. So like some people are like, what do you mean you talk to Solomon? I'm like, yeah. Do you not talk to dead people? Like, because that's a pretty key ingredient of magic.
Right.
So, like, you're supposed to be able to talk to dead people at this. Like, you shouldn't be talking to demons if you can't talk to dead people. Actually,
sure.
Like, it's a core basic magical skill, right? So yeah, so Introduction to Witchcraft from my end is basically done. Like it's at the end.
Okay.
Here's something people might not know. I didn't know until I started writing books. It takes if I work hard, from when I start writing a book, not when I start researching, but when I start writing it, to when I turn a manuscript in, is not as long as it takes from me turning a manuscript in to putting that book on a shelf. Like it takes a year basically between when I turn in a manuscript and that book actually exists.
Really? Yeah. It's a long process then overall. Yeah.
It's not a long process. It's that when I turn a manuscript in, nobody even opens that file for like 4 months. Which is, as a control freak, infuriating.
Right.
Every day I want to message them like, did you read it? Did you read it? Did you read it?
Right.
They don't care for that. So
right. Well, that book is coming out in October, you said, most likely,
that book is assuming my publisher meets all their deadlines. Which I will say I have yet to have a publisher do. Like I have yet to have a book come out on the original date that like in my contract we agreed on.
Right.
And that's not because I missed deadlines. Right. That's like 1 year it was because there was twice there was like a global pandemic. Once there was a paper shortage. Like there are reasons. I'm not complaining, but it's just like I'm not saying publishers do it wrong, but it is hard and scary. Other things I've got going on. So I'm finishing up my work with Sefer HaOtot, which is a Hebrew manuscript of these Solomonic Pentacles. Never before published. Like it's available only in manuscript form. Like there are scans in the National Library of Israel website if you read Hebrew, right? But never before even published in Hebrew, much less in translation. So right now I currently have available a translation, but you got to be like a nerd to work through that translation. So the way to get the translation right now is either have supported the Kickstarter 2 years ago, that one's out, or if you're in my Pentacle course, we're working with that as well. But I will have like a edition with like commentary and like expanded. Like I will explain it in I don't know. Again, I'm actually waiting on my editor on that one. A different editor.
That's something to look forward to as well. Okay.
Yeah, so that I have no idea when that'll come out, but it'll have these gorgeous new illustrations by Elizabeth Empyrean. Like new. I'm like Alice in Wonderland, where I feel like all books should have conversations and pictures. I think it's like if you look at old like occult books, they're all gorgeously illustrated. I really like, dear other authors, I don't know why your books don't have illustrations. My books all have illustrations. I think they should have pictures in them. I like it when books have pictures. Because they'll have like gorgeous full color pictures from Hadean. And then I have a brand new tarot course opening called Getting Good at Tarot, The
Okay.
first course will be January 19th.
Okay.
Quite soon. Yeah. So like all of my courses, the first lesson is free. So you can like
Great.
see if you like it or not. There's scholarships and payment plans available.
Great.
It is cheaper if you sign up before the free class. So like if you believe in me and sign up for the class, it's a little cheaper than if you wait for the free one and then sign up, which is again because I need a critical mass of people to sign up to make the course happen.
Sure.
So that's me and my colleague Marco Felgairish. So it's a year-long course, and every topic so it's 25 lessons, 2 per month plus like the free lesson at the beginning. Right. And so for every topic except the free one, which he and I are going to teach together, every topic there's 2 lessons. So you'll get 1 lesson from him focusing on the Tarot de Marseille and like his methods, and then you'll get another lesson from me focusing on Smith Rider-Waite. And that's part of, remember what I was saying, like I'm always focusing on like cross training,
right?
Like it's the same deal, right? So like this is not a course for people who've never opened a tarot deck before, right? But this is a course, it's called Getting Good at Tarot, because you're like okay at it, and at the end of this course you will be good at it, right? Like you're getting good at it. And so like you see these 2 different methods in these 2 different decks, and almost all decks are based on one of those. Right. So like if you know those 2, almost all decks are some version of one of those, or occasionally a combination. Not everything, but that's 90% of all tarot decks, right? And so if you really, but I think people don't always understand that they are not the same. Like you can't read Marseille the same way you read like Smith-Waite. And so I think seeing both of them, and he and I have quite different styles. So for example, he does a lot of really big like tableau readings where you put down like 12 or 16 cards at once. Whereas I'm a much bigger fan of like asking a series of shorter questions that I'll read like 3 cards and then ask another question and another 3, right? And there's just differences in style like that. So in this course, you'll really get a lot of that like cross training.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, I live in Asia. I live mostly in South Korea. And what's interesting to me is how big tarot is in Asia. Like, you know, you don't really see much of like Solomonic Magick or Western esoteric tradition. There's the OTO in Japan, but overall you don't see, you know, they have their own homebrewed, you know, magical systems and philosophies and what have you, religions. But tarot is something that's like pretty much most of Asia. It's huge, which I find to be interesting. That's like one of the Western esoteric traditional practices, I guess you would say, that has kind of, you know, it doesn't really have any boundaries. It seems like big everywhere.
I agree. Well, here, if you have a lot of Asian listeners, I will
there
say
you go.
My Introduction to Witchcraft class is also available in Chinese, as is my Big Book of Magical Incense is also available in Chinese. And the intro book will hopefully eventually come out in Chinese, ideally the same time it comes out in English, but I don't think that's true. So I have a Chinese translator that I work with, and also a Spanish translator that I work with. So my
that's awesome.
And Italian, Julia Tirolo. So my stuff is all available in those languages with like real human translation by a magician who like I handpicked. Like they know what.
Well, that's really good info. That's good info to have. Yeah. All right. Well, I think any other final things to mention? I think we covered most of the ground I wanted to cover. Your courses sound pretty good. They sound interesting. People can check out that free lesson, as you mentioned, right?
But they have to sign up for it in advance.
Okay. So I'll include.
They don't actually. They could sign up for it after the fact and get a video. But like they can't just show up to the class. Like they need to sign up in advance. So signing up for all my stuff, you can find it at www.witchlessons.com.
Okay.
Or you can just put my name in Google with quotes, but I'm sure there'll be a link down here somewhere.
Okay. Do you have a book on tarot? Do you have planned to release one?
Yeah. So this course will almost certainly become a book on the Smith Rider-Waite tarot.
Okay.
But I also own a company called The Fool's Dog. We publish digital tarot decks. So I will say, like, actually, if you have a digital tarot deck on your phone, there's a high likelihood that it's a Fool's Dog deck. Like, we're among the like leading digital publishers of tarot decks. Cool. I would say this is not like a slam on other publishers, but most other digital tarot apps, when you use them, they're not intended for people who read tarot. Like they're a magic 8-ball, and that's fun, but they're not made by like it's clear that the person who made it maybe is not a serious tarot reader. They don't let you do all the things you want to be able to do with tarot. Whereas our apps, like everybody involved in this company reads tarot. Our lead programmer only kind of reads tarot, admittedly, but everybody else is a serious professional tarot reader, and she reads tarot some, right?
Okay.
Like everybody's a serious tarot reader. We work directly with artists and authors to do their publishing.
Oh, nice, nice, nice.
So again, I'll probably eventually publish a book on tarot because I own a tarot publishing company, so it would be lucrative. I'd make the money on both ends, so that would be nice.
Yeah. Okay, cool, cool. Well, yeah, it's been really interesting. The tarot lesson sounds really good. And you mentioned you have your 2 previous books, one coming out in October as well. And then current courses. Oh yeah, I guess another question that I could mention related to your courses are they sort of you have to join them by the start date, or are there courses that are like ongoing as well? Like
You don't. So they
you can
go
jump
in order.
anytime?
Like
Yeah.
So depending how experienced you are as a witch. So if like my introduction to witchcraft course, if indeed you are a total beginner, which objectively most of the people in the course are not, if you are, you better start with lesson 1. Now you can join it anytime. You'll get all the back videos, which means you're getting like 4 lectures of every video. Like every year I taught it, I reteach it live because I want again, I'm a teacher, so I need that like
sure.
I think it's important for students to be able to ask questions and for me to relate it to things that are going on in the world right now, and et cetera, et cetera. So you get a ton of back videos, which like, and no one is saying you should watch every lesson 1. Like just pick one and watch it. And I would say they get better over time. So like I think they get better every time. So always watch the new one. You get all the back videos, and you get invitation to all the courses moving forward. So like once you're in the course, you're just in the course forever.
I see. Okay, that's a big benefit. You get all the next season, I guess I'll call it.
Exactly, right? So a lot of people. So what I say is like whenever you sign up, just jump right in.
Okay.
And if it doesn't make sense, like ideally watch some videos and catch up, especially if you are actually a beginner. But if you're not a total beginner, you could probably just jump in the middle.
Okay.
Right. Especially, where they just started courses, like the semester just started like October at Halloween, I think, for all of them. So we're actually, I will say I just taught intro lesson 3 yesterday, like lesson 3.
Okay.
So we're not actually that far in, but you can jump in at any point. You get everything. The tarot course, obviously you don't get back lessons because they don't exist yet.
Right. It's the first. Yeah. It's the first iteration.
The first one. So you get them as they come out.
Okay.
Right? But yeah, you get everything. You can join anytime.
Okay.
Right now, I am running Introduction to Witchcraft.
Okay.
Planetary Pentacles. This new tarot one are the ones I'm teaching live. And then I also have some other longer courses. There's one on like working with the dead. There's an intermediate divination, etc. And there's also a bunch of like single, what I call special topics classes.
Okay.
So there's one on like Babylonian incantation bowls.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Or like early colonial American witch bottles, or like some particular topic that I just wanted to nerd out about.
Okay.
Aresh Kagal and the PGM. I have these one-shot lessons as well. Okay. That's all on the website.
All right, cool. Well,
sorry this turned into such an advertisement. I didn't
no, it's interesting.
I'm just excited. Like I love teaching. I'm excited to talk about it.
And I think I do have quite a few amount of listeners here in Asia, and I think they'd be interested in the tarot course. So, you mentioned are there any like I guess they could check out. I'll include all the links below, but there's also you mentioned a like a coupon code, or maybe for listeners.
Oh yes, so I'll give people whenever you are watching this video down in the comments, there will be a coupon code for 10% off. Any lesson or course.
Okay, awesome. All right.
You can't use a coupon with a payment plan. So a coupon, you got to pay it all in advance. Okay. That is literally because I don't know how to do that. Like I don't actually know how to make PayPal take a coupon.
Right.
Is why you can't combine them. But there's also scholarships. So really, if that 10%, if you need it, the only difference between a coupon and a scholarship is that a scholarship I have to manually set up by hand. Like that's really the difference from my end. Yeah, so I can write scholarships, including full scholarships, right? For people who need them, they can just email me and talk about the process, or the advert for the course. If you actually read the text, will tell you how to apply for a scholarship.
Okay, cool. Yeah, maybe later on, if there's time, another day, maybe we could talk about tarot. That'd be an interesting one because I know there's so much interest here. So much interest on this side of the world with tarot, so that would be a good episode. I did one that was sort of a remedial episode it was like 2-3 years ago, but haven't really dove deep on that topic too, so that'd be good.
I would love to come back and do tarot. If you want, I could even talk to my Chinese translator. We could live translate it.
Oh, that would actually be pretty cool too.
I can't voluntold him to do that, especially because he's currently in the military.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So we have to schedule it.
Right, right,
is
right.
the
Okay,
trick.
cool. Yeah, we can work something out. All right, sounds
Yep.
good. Thanks for joining the show, and until next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me. I had a lot of fun. Bye, everybody.